Coach Pfaff is an internationally experienced and recognized educator and coach with 47 years multifaceted work. He has a background in directorships of international training centers, coaching staff development, Division I intercollegiate track and field as a head coach, as well as numerous assistant coaching and teaching positions. Dan has extensive experience as a lecturer and curriculum designer for international, national, regional, state, and community level sports theory symposia in schools. Dan is also actively involved with consulting services to a number of professional teams, support staffs, and individual athletes in a variety of sports, both domestically and internationally. Currently, Dan is involved with numerous international staff and center audits with emphasis on biomechanical efficiencies and return to play programming. Dan is also internationally recognized as a high performance center director, having served domestically and internationally. But what might be even more impressive is Dan's performance overview. So Dan has tutored 53 Olympians, including 10 medalists, 58 World Championship competitors, including 11 medalists, and 5 world record holders. He has directed athletes to 57 national records, including 2 Paralympic gold medalists and 2 Paralympic world records. Dan has coached at 10 Olympic Summer Games and served on 5 Olympic Games coaching staffs for 5 different countries and 10 World Championship staffs for 6 different countries. Dan has also lectured in 37 countries and published in over 20 countries. He's appointed as a coaching education curriculum chair for both the United States Track and Field Coaches Education Schools and the NACAC, the NACAC, then you can correct me if I mispronounce that, Caribbean Basing Project. He's the lead instructor for each organization at the level 1, 2, and 3 schools, provided consultancy to players and teams in the NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, Canadian Winter Olympic programs, WTA, AFL, European soccer leagues as well. Dan has coached 29 NCAA individual national championships and 150 All-Americans. And he's the lead staff member on teams that have won 17 NCAA national team championships, 15 with women, 2 with men. Then that's a very, very impressive resume. Again, thank you so much for being here today, having this conversation with us, and being part of our conference. And we're very excited to watch your presentation today. Thank you so much. All yours, Dan.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to all the organizations involved in producing this symposium. I'd like to start out by doing a little bit of a consumer warning on this lecture and admitting guilt after Jim's excellent presentation. I'm going to be convicted as charged by Jim on some of these slides, so I apologize for that. It's obvious I need more coaching on some of the topics Jim brought up. This lecture is going to be tremendously biased. It's biased by my experiences, my network, my evolution as a coach, and the epoch time periods I grew up in. So I titled this Energy Leaks and Disturbances. This is going to be a little bit biased to running, but I think these essentials and first principles and fundamentals equally apply in the pool or in the water or on the bike. I have extensive work working with triathletes, so I kind of have some road test on this. This photo on the cover slide, as a young student of physics, I became enamored with a branch of mathematics called fractal geometry. And this is a fractal pattern. And what I'd like attendees to keep in the background as we go through this stuff is, as coaches, we're generalists in nature. I grew up as a farmer, a son of a construction worker, so I was forced into being a neo-generalist from the get-go. I think it's our job to look for trends and patterns, because as Jim alluded to, there are very few absolutes in sport or human development. There's layers and layers to this process, and most items that we're going to discuss exist on a spectrum. So I'm kind of an anti-absolutist. So that's my consumer warning. So right now, as Joe alluded to, I go around the world and I audit coaches and performance staff. And from those audits and SWOT analysis, I end up mentoring quite a few people on a lot of different facets of sport. And from that mentorship, I end up being the bad cop in a lot of instances. I'm kind of a gatekeeper or an enforcement driver. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So these are not just my personal experiences. These are experiences collated from tons of audits and SWOT analysis over almost 50 years. So a little bit of terminology. Two guys that I have a lot of respect for, Greg Cook and Mark Verstegen, have both addressed this concept of energy leaks or ergonomic analysis, if you will. So in a simplified form, we're going to talk about ways athletes or coaches allow energy to not be totally maximized or utilized in the best fashion. And don't worry about keeping a lot of notes off these slides. Joe has the slide deck, and he has my permission to share the slide deck with any of the attendees. So I think we need to, first and foremost, build file systems as we go through this. We're trying to corral a lot of chaotic information, as Jim alluded to. So in sport, I think one of the biggest frustrators that an athlete or a coach or performance staff runs into on a daily basis is injury. You know, we're injured at birth and it's kind of downhill from there. So whether we're dealing with a chronic injury or an acute injury, injuries are always on the radar screen. So the definition of chronic is super, super important. I think most of us deal with athletes and chronic injuries on a daily basis. Hopefully we avoid acute injury, but in triathlon, obviously with bike wrecks and what have you, and stress fractures from marathon running, oftentimes we have to deal with the acute side of injury. So hopefully some of my goals for this discussion is we can leave today becoming a little bit better coach or athlete or practitioner, become a better consumer. You know, obviously not a lot of us are therapists or medical experts, but we need to know the jargon and the layers and spectrum of information involved so that we can direct our athletes and our teams into being better consumers and purchasers of performance services. Jim spent a lot of time talking about communication earlier, and this is a breakdown that I see continuously, the silos that Jim alluded to. You know, how do we get a horizontal paradigm operating where the communication between athletes, coaches, and performance staff providers is fluid, dynamic, transparent, and non-threatening? Hopefully we'll come out of this with a little better understanding of the kinesiological factors for wellness and efficiency of movement. I think there's a bias currently in educational circles on gross anatomy and physiology, but I think there's a gap or void in understanding how these systems interact and work together. So I use the old school term of kinesiology here. A side benefit, hopefully from this talk today, is finding ways to improve work qualities and capacities in our athletes in a variety of functions. Obviously, we want to reduce acute and chronic injury occurrence. This is a big one. How do we reduce lost man hours and competition absences? This is a big KPI factor. We record a lot of how many hours did we miss in practice, or how many days a week, or we had to alter practice radically from what was designed, and how many comps. You know, if you have athletes that are missing key competitions on a regular basis, there's obviously something that we're missing or we're not seeing. And how can we improve coach-athlete reporting and solution skills? A lot of athletes at the elite level are afraid to report, or they don't know how to report, or they have gaps in their reporting methodology. So how can we improve those debrief moments and debrief constructions to come up with better solutions. So I'm going to use the term big rocks quite a bit today. So what do we analyze when we're looking for energy leaks or energy disturbances? And what are the causes of these aberrations? And then once we note these things, how do we nudge, encourage change, modify, or mitigate? So whether you're in the water or you're on the bike or you're running on land, it's a puzzle. It's a movement control factor. And I think Jim alluded to reductionism. A lot of times in sports medicine, our coach return to play dynamics, we get caught up in muscle systems and perhaps skeletal systems like strengthening, or this is shut off, or this is weak, or this is not working well. But true movement control has a lot of influencers. And on the left column here, I'll just briefly go through what really controls movement, whether it's in water, on land, or on the bike. Obviously, muscle systems, and within muscle systems, various types of contractile environments: isometric, isotonic, concentric, eccentric, so multiple factorials in the muscle system dynamic. The skeletal system, how joints move, the range of movement of a joint, how the various appendages or segments are working together. Underlying this is fascial systems, and relatively new science of how fascial systems influence this muscle skeletal system interface. And within this collagen world of fascial systems, there's other cofactors like tendons and the ligaments and the bursas and the fat pads and the capsule of the joints. Underlying this is the fluid dynamics or the joint hydraulics. So how fluid moving through this collagen matrix is affecting movement, or power output, or movement expression. Obviously, we have the brain, spinal cord, and CNS involved in this. And underlooked factors, proprioceptors like Golgi tendon apparatus, Ruffini fibers, Pacinian corpuscles, muscle spindles. How are these things interfacing with the above items? Lymphatics is another often overlooked factor in movement control. And then lastly, organ and organ actions, organ health, and how they're influencing these things. So I think it's oversimplistic and reductionist to have an injury or a movement compromise and just work on muscle and skeletal system dynamics. It's way more complex than that. So I mentioned this hydraulic system. You know, we hear a cliche, the human body 70% water. Well, it's water and a lot of related fluid and gel dynamics. So the hydraulic system of the human body is primarily operated within this collagen matrix of fascia, capsules, the retinaculums, the bursas, the fat pads, the lymphatics. And these hydraulics are even involved in the vascular and vestibular system. The vestibular system's interesting, it's overlooked, underappreciated. If you've ever had a real bad sinus infection or inner ear infection, then you understand the power of vestibular fluid dynamics on movement expression. So at the end of the day, we're really talking today about the ergonomics, erg being a scientific term for work or work output or work function. So when I talk about erg, it's a gross overview of energy expenditure, energy utilization. So how do we start the process? Well, I use the term movement screens or movement grids. And I think coaches have been using this concept for centuries, for sure decades. And it's called watching practice intently with a purpose. Do you have layers and spectrums for what you're looking at? For us, every item on the training schedule is a movement screen. I study how people get out of their car and walk to the stadium or to the training complex, how they sit between reps, how they stand. You know, we've even solved some problems using baby monitors, watching athletes, how they sleep. Certain sleep postures promote chronic injury factors. So it's not just a clinical analysis or a series of tests. There's layers and layers to movement screens or movement grids. And in my opinion, everything that the athlete is doing is a movement screen. So coaches have to develop what we call coach's eye. We've got to be able to see landmarks and planes of the body and axes, and angles of joint segments. And seeing in real time has to be built upon video and photo review skills. We have to start somewhere, maybe with kinograms or slow motion analysis. But if we don't know what good movement is versus bad movement, and we can get into all kinds of discussions about technical models. Good movers have certain common denominators, common expressions versus bad movers. And so that could be a starting spot. So is there a technical model? In 50 years of working in a wide array of sports, I think there's some common denominators of certain positions, postures, movement schemes, and vectors of expression, whether you're on a bike or in the water or running on land. So we've done decades of intra-athlete and inter-athlete studies, and we've done these longitudinally over time. So looking at, in an intra-athlete study, how things change over time through their career. Inter-athlete study would involve looking at the best performers. I think hard to quantify, but a lot of this science, we get lost and we fail to put a litmus test. Are our concepts as our model, is it logical, is it based on common sense, and above all, replicability? And through this technical model, we often prompt athletes through analogies or cues or feedback. And these systems have to be rationally utilized. And the debate of internal and external cue and mass versus distributed feedback is topics for another day, but they are considerations in how you manage, nudge, and mitigate with a technical model. So why even bother? Well, I think in every instance as a coach, we're continually doing cost-benefit analysis. Like if we change something in a movement strategy, you know, what's the timeline for change, the incubation period, what's the payoff? Is it, you know, a lot of times it's like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, it could be a time bomb. And so it may not be broke today, but it could be broke tomorrow if left unabated. Are there energy leaks or interruptions? Are there obvious things that we see, note, detect, and monitor and look at trend analysis and patterns over time that seemingly indicate that there's interruption or leak? What's playing into the chronic injury factor? If your group of athletes get the same types of injuries at certain types of the training year or at certain stages of development, then that may prompt us to look at some of these ergonomic energy leaks and energy aberration factors. Obviously, acute injury factors are a big one. If athletes are getting radical stress fractures of the foot or the sacrum, or God forbid, even femoral stress fractures, obviously there's some mechanical influence on these acute arrivals of injury. And lastly, the interference with key sport movement needs. So a person may be tremendously efficient in the water, on the bike, but abysmal on the land. So it's a juggling act in triathlon is how do we manage movement efficiency, movement expression in all three disciplines? So if we have a sound model for this, I think that the positive and negative movement strategies are built upon experiences, injuries, and misconceptions. So what athletes do to get faster, to move with more efficiency, they leverage variables to gain speed. They adjust, adapt, and manipulate lever and axis systems. They use joints and muscle timing systems in a certain manner. They sense momentum. They crave speed of movement. I don't care what event, what discipline, athletes crave speed, a change in speed, an improvement of speed. In running specific, they manipulate support phases to influence their posture. And The posture is the platform for movement expression. In running, during the flight phase, athletes reposition limbs in order to apply force. So what's happening in flight is an important thing. And then looking at the limbs and the athlete's center of gravity is a pretty good template for judging efficiencies in movement, whether you're on land or even on a bike or in the water especially. So how do coaches get perceptual grids for this? Well, we can look at things like range of movement, speed of movement, how joints are sequencing, the reactiveness of the athlete during the movement, how they sequence gross body movement parts, sequencing the fine movement parts, postures of the key support mechanisms. So the support mechanisms in water is quite a bit different from that of being on the bike, and that's very different from being on the land in marathon. But there are key support mechanisms at key moments in the movement expression that dictate postural expressions. Symmetry is another good grid. If we're tremendously asymmetrical, then we're inviting energy leakage, we're promoting chronic injury risk, and ultimately we could be opening the door to acute injury risk. There's always aberrations of movement, idiosyncratics and whatnot. It's always a tough question. Do we nudge this? Do we control this? Do we mitigate this? Do we monitor this? But aberrations are something that have to be noted, monitored, and challenged over time. Another indicator is readiness and body language. You know, a lot of times body language and tone of voice and eye contact and what have you are great indicators for how movement expression is being undertaken. And the perspective of observation of coach is critical. I think we get in the habit of standing in the same place, observing tasks, and perspective, changing your perspective, looking head on, looking from behind, looking from side, using underwater monitoring devices and environments, traveling with athletes as they move on their bike are important factors and features. Constantly looking at axes of rotation of the body, the longitudinal axis of the entire body, the transverse axes like the shoulder and hip axes, longitudinal foot axis. In running, we spend a lot of time analyzing contact and flight time relationships. So in symmetry, you know, like if we were looking at runners, how their joint segments and positions are lining up. So we can see in these three photos, three different expressions. The girl in the bottom left corner have more limb segments symmetrical and aligned, the vectors working together in a synergistic fashion than the other two photos. In the other two photos, they have some segments and the long axis of the body cooperating, but they have other limb segments, namely their arms, that are totally out of sequence there. So with this injury environment in discussion, we enter a realm or a topic called return to play or return to perform. I think we have to identify first and foremost, is this acute rehab? Is it transitional training? Is it being done in real time, real world demands? There's a bias to clinical, slow, linear progressions in return to play. We really have to analyze the session or the game or the activity to build final testing of readiness. And we can't underestimate the cognitive perceptual task in the late stage in this return to play. So Jim alluded to this somewhat in his talk today. What we find through motor re-education and return to play, return to perform, is building a toolbox of tremendous variance. Are we altering forces? Are we altering velocities, angles of insult, duration of these factors right out of the box after the initial complaint of acute or chronic injury? So in this photo, I want to highlight the power of perspective. So this is shot at 300 frames per second. We've got all the tech in the world. We've got OptiJump on the ground looking at contact times, flight times. We got cameras from behind and head on the side. We've got a lot of stuff going on. This athlete was suffering from bilateral Achilles tendinopathy. For 2 years, he'd traveled all over Europe seeing specialists, having injections, actually had a surgery. 2 years, no success. It was so bad, he was unable to play with his kids. I want you to focus on the heel counter of the shoe, the white part of the shoe. So as this foot recovers and he's about to apply force on the ground, as he contacts, you'll notice his heel counter distorts medially or across the midline. And then as he goes to the right foot, even more rotational shear strain on the Achilles complex. And it doesn't get better as he runs. Each step, there's more violent and faster shear strain on the Achilles complex, on the foot complex. And the problem with sports medicine, and you would not see this if you were coaching standing on the side or looking from head on. We're only seeing this from a posterior view. And like we said, he'd been all over Europe seeing specialists and therapists, and everybody was myopically focused on the Achilles or the foot or the ankle or the lower leg. I want you to look at his left shoulder now. So switch focus from this heel counter to his left shoulder. Look at the tilting of the shoulder axis and the malalignment of the shoulder compared to the frame of the body. So as he runs, when the right foot hits, the shoulder is in pretty normative position and function. But as he comes into the left foot contact, you can see the shoulder deflecting to the left and dropping to the left. Well, through additional debriefing, we found out that he had dislocated that shoulder as a youth playing rugby, and it had never been addressed. So as soon as we addressed the dysfunction of the left shoulder, both Achilles problems disappeared. So it's the power of perspective, the power of what else, where else, looking globally. So this is a young lady, an example. The left side looks pretty normal, but on the right side, you can see a listing, a tilting. Through time, that's going to put undue stress on every aspect of the leg on the right side. It's creating havoc in the spine. It's creating craziness in the shoulder girdle action. If you look at how the arm is swinging and angulating on the right side, comparing it to the left side, you can see a lot of aberration of movement and dysfunction of movement. Here's a world-class sprinter looking at head position and knee position, going through a sprint. And sprinting, you know, these micro movement energy leaks are fatal. It could be 1/10 of a second. I realize in triathlon marathoning, you know, it's a little bit different factor, but you do have the repetition. So if you're losing 0.5% every foot contact and you multiply that to number of contacts in a marathon, it becomes a very big number. Here's an example of preseason and postseason. So we have an athlete on the left coming early season, zigzag running, going all over the place, limb segments not being vector synergized. And then on the right, he's at a competition, a pre-meet practice just before the race, and you can see a lot different vector summation and limb positioning compared to what he looked like in the preseason, early season workouts. So this was addressed through therapeutic intervention and creative exercise and program design over time. So we look at torsos and hip postures and hand and arm aberrations. And this can be done in the pool. It can be done on the bike. And people say, well, on the bike, we're kind of closed chain. But there's a lot of upper body undulation and listing occurring on the bike, you know, depending on how we set up seat height and have different cranks, different frames. There's a price that you pay in the upper body and even in arm and shoulder movement on the bike, and especially in the pool. And then we put people under pressure and we'll see even different aberrations of movement and compensations of movement. because they're reacting to a more chaotic environment. So this is why we're encouraging people to have multiple layers of screening an individual without competition is one level of screening, but we also have to screen and measure and analyze movement in competitive environments. So whether they're in the water or on the bike or on land, looking at their movement aberrations and expression is important in a variety of environments. So whether it's acceleration in the water or on the bike, I'm just throwing up some of the things that we look for to look at ergonomic efficiencies or outputs, or to maybe get ahead of a chronic injury factor or prevent or mitigate risk for an acute injury factor. And so that was for starting, and for top end, which in marathoning might be steady state running. These would be some of the directives or the factors that we would be looking at or measuring over time. And again, as I said earlier, the slide deck is available to you, so don't race through trying to copy these kinds of things. For time expediency's sake, I'm just presenting them as examples of landmarks that we use to build file systems for analysis. So how can we intervene if we notice things are poor? And we have limited access to therapeutic input or expertise. Well, time standard things would be introducing various mobility exercises or flexibility or fascial exercises or different activation activities. If we do have access to expertise, it might involve soft tissue manipulation or joint manipulation, or some practitioners use acupuncture. After the intervention, it's super important to re-cue and correct themes or movement, to do a movement reintegration or a reboot of the computer. We might have to go to plan B. We might have to adjust and adapt the workout a little bit, because we still see after an intervention, they're not quite hitting on all 8 cylinders. Sometimes we even have to go to a plan C. And hopefully we don't have to go to a cessation of session, but at certain times, if we're out of ideas for intervention, it's prudent to stop the session. And from all of this in the debrief review process and looking at trends and patterns over time, hopefully this leads to a refinement of long-term rehab and prehab strategies. I'm using the term movement expression, and a lot of times in sports medicine or in coaching, we kind of look at our fixes or our interventions or our mitigation from the strength or power or rate of force development paradigm. Movement signatures are critical in return to play, return to perform. And Matt Jordan in Calgary is a good friend and colleague, and he works a lot in ACLs, and it's way more complicated than just improving or restoring strength or power outputs or rate of force development. And there's plenty of research out there that it's complex, it's layers, and timelines are all over the shop. So this is my wife. I live in a middle-class neighborhood, and she volunteers me with all the neighbors. I'm kind of the resident therapist. So my neighbor contacted me. This is his son. He's a competitive swimmer, very elite level at the high school. And he had shoulder complaint, chronic shoulder bicep tendonitis and shoulder capsule problems. And he went to a well-meaning PT clinic, and they gave him all kinds of exercises with rubber bands and movement expression. And 6 weeks later is no better. He got to where he couldn't brush his teeth or comb his hair. And I said, well, take a picture and send it to me. And hopefully anybody on this cast can see that there's a problem if you compare the left shoulder to the right shoulder. The left shoulder is pretty normal. If you look at the right shoulder, we can see that the joint is not really in position. And so our joint's in the right position to do the task. It may not be as extreme as this, but joint positioning and joint dynamics are super important in this return to play or movement efficiency puzzle. So I think it's important over time that we constantly update and analyze and look for trends and patterns in the athlete's history, understanding how their genetics are influencing these things, the demands on the sport, and where these energy leaks are coming from. So this is a constant reboot of induction interviews, debrief systems, getting gatekeepers together to communicate in a horizontal fashion, get out of the silos, ever expanding networks. Like if you're out of ideas, expand the network. And don't underestimate these key genetical markers. They influence return to play and programming tremendously. So the solutions, whether it's acute, rote sports medicine, procedures versus holistic, concurrent return to play, what have you, all kinds of debates. The purpose of this lecture is to get people talking, exploring, searching, thinking outside the box, as Jim encouraged us earlier in his talk. So I think one of the big problems in elite sport, especially elite triathlon training, is there's a big difference between clinical practice and what I call triage. So how do we save the workout or save a portion of the session versus long-term fixes, if you will? So clinical is kind of a slower burn, guided by science, linear type approach, where triage is what can we do to save the day, to save the moment. So these are, I work with Wounded Warrior. These are two military guys. So some of our progression is just walking and analyzing walking and looking at things like their foot axis. What's their shoulder axis doing? What's the hip axis doing? How is the foot striking the ground, the various phases of the contact at touchdown, at mid stance, at toe off? What are the angles that we're seeing at the ankle joint, at the knee joint, at the hip joint? How are the arms counterbalancing the legs? If you look at our guy on the right, is coming back from traumatic brain injury. If you look at his arms, very, very guarded, controlled, inefficient use of the arms. Why do we have him walking backwards? Because he has no reference for compensating and cheating by moving in an opposite direction. So we get a true picture of where some sources of movement control aberration is occurring. So in this ergonomic and KPI and hierarchy march, my bias is we've got to get away from this isolatory approach and drift more into a concurrent force, velocity, angle, and duration system. So one of our ways is to adapt running. So we'll abridge the gait. So we call it dribbling. So we're going to have a concentric activity where the foot is just revolving around the ankle. If they check out and they can master that shape at a variety of velocities and whatnot, then we would progress to over the calf. So we increase the radius. And again, coming back to our idea, we're going to constantly juggle angles, velocities, forces, and durations. And then if the ankle and the calf check out, we might progress to doing an over the knee activity. So this is a progressive manner, alluding to what Jim talked about earlier on constraints. We're building different constraints by reducing the radius of revolution, contact times, flight times, ranges of movement. We might segue into low amplitude, short wavelength plyometrics, whether it's being done in single support, double support, forward, backwards. In this case, we have the athlete holding a med ball to take the arms out of it to increase frontal anterior chain loading. So these are things that can be done on a return to play, trying to improve joint coordination, joint integrity, amortization factors of the three key joints, and then might segue into power expression with different types of sand plyos, different single support, double support activities. And that might kick us into even more advanced plyometrics or activities. And again, this is kind of biased to land and running, but you can create these same kind of constructs and first principles in the water and on the bike. We use a lot of throwing in return to play and motor re-education, coming up with different directions, multiple planes and velocity and load and complexity factors. So this is like an overhead back. So this is a power expression throw. So we can get metrics and various times of the training year with various weights, and that will give us an indicator of what's going on posterior and anterior chain. And we can build complexity where we're involving a plyometric and a throw expression, and we can look at the parabola of the implement that he's throwing and the parabola of his center of mass. And this can give us some tremendous readouts on expression of movement and control of movement, summation of vectors. These are some more of the complex throwing exercises. Roger Federer on a return to play from an ankle sprain. So he's not doing the real task, he's doing an abridged task, but he's segued from a closed chain rehabilitation schematic to a more open chain. And acceleration is kind of our final test. So I realize acceleration is not a huge KPI in marathon runners, but there is an acceleration component at the start of the race and changing of terrain as there is on the bike and there are in the pool. So do you have grids on your acceleratory movement when athletes are changing speed in the water or on the bike or on the land, a checklist to look for ergonomic factors, ergonomic energy leaks? And fatigue is always a huge factor. So we use things like tensive myographic and EMG, force plates, OptiJump, 3D kinematics. One of my pet peeves is a lot of therapists keep sending people back and saying, oh, this muscle's weak or it's shut off. I struggle with that. Sometimes a muscle that's testing or expressing weak just may be tired. And do we have data on this within session, within the week, within the cycle, and during the competition itself? So change in direction is not such a huge factor, but there are turns in the swim. There are a lot of change direction factors on the bike, and depending on the marathon course, there is some change in direction features. So are we training for those? Are we measuring those? Do we have a template to look at the key kinematic factors and the key kinetic factors and how they handle this from a cognitive load factor? So even on a bike, there's a change in direction from on the pedal, on the crank itself. There's a change in direction with various turns and sharpness of turns and changes in terrain. In the pool there, or in water, there's a turn. There's always turns. You know, those are moments and oftentimes areas that are overlooked in analysis, and there's key time units to be gained by coaching and monitoring those. So the teaching imperatives for me are, can we see landmark positions and actions during the various phases of the activity? And can we identify the worst or the most powerful virus and attack it first? Because what we find, if we can find that first order virus, a lot of times that clears up a lot of subviruses or second order viruses. So a little bit of drinking from the fire hose there, but I just wanted to try to spur some thought, dialogue, research, maybe networking or peer discussion on some of these topics. There's no getting around it that injury is a major headache we encounter daily. It could be acute, it could be chronic, but it's there. And we're constantly in this return to play, return to perform paradigm, whether we like it or not. And sadly, a lot of times in the way sports medicine is developed right now, the clinicians take it early days, but in the late stages, it always comes back to the coach. And if we don't know what's happened beforehand and we don't know the entire spectrum and layers to this, I think we're prone to make mistakes with programming or planning. So I'm going to stop there and kind of open it up for questions.